has the open shot. And you know, like NBA basketball. And now, ladies and gentlemen of the world, put those hands together. Only tonight, starting five for your Sacramento Kings.
You are locked into the Cowbell Kingdom Podcast, frontline coverage of the Sacramento Kings. Now, here are your hosts, Jonathan Santiago and James Ham.
Welcome to the Cowbell Kingdom Podcast. I am James Ham, flying solo for this portion of the podcast. John Santiago is away. He will be back later on for the second portion of the Cowbell Kingdom Podcast, but we are joined by a special guest. With so much going on this summer with the Sacramento Kings, so many possibilities, there's no one like Larry Coon who can break down the fine nuances of the NBA, CBA. Larry, how are you?
I'm doing good, but I think the first order of business is what's Jonathan Santiago doing that's more important than this podcast?
You know, it is really important. I'm going to keep his private stuff private, but it's not very often that John misses. He's usually a guy that is here every single week, so a little different with me flying solo.
Well, I'll try and be gentle.
That's right. All right, so Larry, this is a really crazy offseason for the Sacramento Kings. I mean, you see Isaiah Thomas, you see Rudy Gay, both different types of possibilities with both of them. What do you make of this Rudy Gay situation where he has so many options? Number one, he can opt in and take his $19.3 million to the bank. Option number two, he can, opt out. He can opt into a longer deal with the Kings or with some other team, or option three, I guess, would be he could sign a 3-year extension. How do you see this playing out with Rudy Gay?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation, and it's sort of an interesting dynamic that Pete D'Alessandro created when he brought him in. He's a guy who in Toronto really wasn't living up to his billing, and Pete gambled that some of that was situational, and that if he brought him in, he would fill more of the role that he needed for him, and he turned out to be vindicated. He came in and his scoring efficiency was a lot higher in Sacramento than I think than before, and he was providing some of that. Now that said, he is a very expensive option for a player who is not quite that multidimensional. So at $19.3 million. The logic there is, okay, he can opt out and the team is no worse off. The team had some bad contracts on the books that was really going to set them back a couple of years when he tried to rebuild the thing. So let's bring in some guys who could either go either way, or who were fungible, who could he could sort of deal with easier. And Rudy Gay's situation is one of those where if Rudy opts in, he's in for another year at $19 million. That's not that bad for what he provides. And so if he decides to say, fine, and then in 2015, we're really dealing with a better free agent class anyways. If he opts out and leaves, well, that's $19 more million that he has to work with, so that's fine too. I don't know if he's going to want to extend him or, have him opt out and re-sign, because I don't know if Pete D'Alessandro is really thinking about Rudy Gay as a long-term solution, especially at the price he's looking at. Now, if he wants to opt out and give a big discount in terms of more years, I think Pete will be all ears. But, for now, I think he's the best options right now for Rudy, given the market this year, would be to opt in to that $19 million, because I don't think he's going to make that much either with the Kings or anywhere else if he becomes a free agent this summer. The flip side of that coin is that if he waits to 2015 to become a free agent, that's going to be a lot stronger free agent class. So maybe just by the law of supply and demand, he could command a little bit more money in a long-term deal if he opts out this year.
Larry, what do you make of Pete D'Alessandro's, it's sort of his reasoning for bringing in Rudy via trade was to get Rudy to come to Sacramento, to understand what Sacramento is like, the people of Sacramento, the fan base, sort of what it's like to live in Sacramento, and then try to, negotiate down the road with him after, as opposed to, the blitz of free agency, you're running at people with a checkbook and nothing else. They don't know you, they don't know your coaching staff or your people or the teammates. What is your thoughts on that approach that D'Alessandro took in this in the Rudy Gay situation?
He knows where he is, and this is not to denigrate Sacramento in the least, because I spent a lot of time there. I love the city, but when you're trying to convince an NBA player, hey, come to Sacramento, you've got a sales job ahead of you, because you're competing with places like Los Angeles and New York. You're also even though they've leveled the playing field financially as much as they can, the big market teams like that still have an advantage in being able to afford more expensive rosters. Brooklyn and New York, Los Angeles are going to be able to withstand a high enough roster and the luxury tax that comes with it that they might be able to offer more money in addition to a living environment that for an NBA player off the top of the head would be a little bit more desirable. So if you're in Sacramento, and you're trying to convince an NBA player of that you're going to be a big fish in a small pond, but it's great being a big fish. Sacramento has a lot of nice advantages. We got a lot of nice areas to live up there, especially as you start to get into the foothills. But there is an amount of salesmanship that goes with that. And part of that sales job can come from, let's bring the guy in here, let's let him experience it firsthand, see what it's like, see how good we're going to treat you, see what kind of nurturing environment it's going to be, see how good the coaching staff is going to be for you, see how much you're going to like the town, see how much you're going to like living here, see how much you're going to be, in terms of sports teams, the Kings are really it in Sacramento. And you're going to be, a bigger celebrity here than you would be in LA, where you would be, almost semi-anonymous unless you're like a Kobe Bryant or a Blake Griffin. So by getting somebody in there and letting them experience that firsthand for a while, that sort of provides some of that. So, and there were rumors that they had had that same conversation about Rajon Rondo, where they were talking to the Celtics, and it went as far as asking Rajon, "Hey, we don't expect you to commit right away. Right now on the phone telling us, yeah, I'll re-sign with you, but I at least want to know that you're going to be open-minded about it and that you would consider it, something down the road where you'd want to stay here." And I guess they didn't get that kind of positive response from him, which is why they didn't pursue a trade any further. So it's a matter of getting people in here where you think that could happen as well.
Interesting. So Rajon Rondo could have been a Sacramento King if he was willing to come here. That's at least the rumor, right?
Yeah, it's not inside information. I haven't talked to Pete D'Alessandro and heard that. I haven't talked to, Danny Ainge or Mike Zarin about that and heard it on the other side. But it was the prevailing rumor, and it was the prevailing rumor that that's what happened.
Yeah. So that's a good segue, though, because the second free agent opportunity that the Sacramento Kings have is with Isaiah Thomas. And,
Right.
Isaiah Thomas just played out his rookie scale contract for a second-round pick. He's at the back end of his first 3 years. He is a restricted free agent because Pete D'Alessandro told us specifically that he intends to extend the qualifying offer to him, which isn't really that much. It's a really low-budget qualifying offer.
2.875.
Yeah, it's really small for a second-round pick. He did reach the starter criteria, so I guess it did go up a little bit. But what do you make of Isaiah Thomas as a player in this market? Do you think that, is the sky the limit? Are we going to see someone throw mad cash at him? Or are the Sacramento Kings going to have an ability to match a deal for this guy where last year, Tyreek Evans got astronomical money for his skill level, around the league? Yeah,
that's the thing that scares you, is that in a market like this one's going to be, which is going to be a seller's market, there's going to be a lot of teams with cap room and not a lot of talent to go around, and somebody's going to end up being overpaid. And Isaiah Thomas might be an ideal candidate. Where is he going to get, $10 million a year, $12 million a year? Probably not. I don't think he's that good. On the other hand, you look at, guys like Tyreek last year who did get overpaid. And, you look at the CBA and you look at the, all the restrictions that they're putting in to try and keep salaries down, and you kind of scratch your head a little bit. But, so the GMs will sort of think about things along the lines that they had been thinking about them before. I got to divert my other phone, sorry. So who knows what kind of offer is going to come in. I would guess that he would be like at least a mid-level type of player, but given the law of supply and demand, he could command a little bit more. And it's one of the things that Pete has been I'm sure aware of is his free agency, the fact that he does want to re-sign him. That he basically traded away Grievous because he wanted to give minutes to Isaiah, and he was coming along so well, and then a backup point guard behind him would be a lot easier to obtain. So I think keeping him is definitely in his plans and wanting to make sure that he can do that, but at the same time staying aware of his budget and how much he's going to be able to pay.
I guess the real question that I have as far as the CBA for you is it acting differently than you thought it would? It seems like the mechanisms that were put in place, teams are still spending, and I guess you have the minimum floor now, which is creeping up. It's up to what you have to spend 90% of the salary cap. But also, the salary cap's taking a huge jump. The luxury tax is taking a huge jump this year. Lots of teams are going to have cash, and it only seems like it's going to get bigger and badder as the new television deal approaches. But are you surprised that, I know we've talked in the past, we thought that there would be a lot of players that were dumped, really good players that were just dumped because teams were going to, be repeat offenders of the luxury tax and would have some fear. But we aren't really seeing it play out that way.
Well, we are seeing fewer taxpayers now, and we are seeing some teams come back to earth a little bit. It's not that the new CBA brought everybody back down to earth, but I had a league guy argue to me, it's that it brought people down to earth in a more reasonable way. Is a Brooklyn or a New York Knicks going to be able to continue spending as much as they want to spend? Sure, but that's only a couple of teams, and then all the other teams that are around that were spending above the tax before, the Bostons, the guys like that, are being brought back down to earth a little bit more. The Dallases, people are being more conscious. And in fact, the first guy who was dumped, you could consider being Tyson Chandler, who right after the new agreement was signed, Tyson Chandler's a free agent. Mark Cuban said, yeah, given the new sort of rules for building a roster that are going to be dictated by the new CBA, we can't afford to keep you, Tyson. So that's when he went to New York, who said, yeah, we'll take him. So I think that it's not quite as bad as the salaries haven't been reined in as much as I was thinking, but I think that those signs are definitely there. The other thing you got to keep in mind is the overarching controlling factor in how much the players make as a group is that player guarantee, and that went down from 57% to 50%, and that's 50% of revenues. Now, when revenues are better than they anticipate, they can go up, but still only the 51%. So what you're really seeing is more the effect of revenues really jumping, for this year. And then when we get the new TV deal in 2017, I think the revenues are really going to jump. There's rumors that the national TV money is going to double, which will by itself put a really big jump into the salary cap and therefore put more money into players' pockets. But the percentage of the revenue overall is still going to be within those parameters. That said, the players and the league both have an opt-out in 2017 where they're going to negotiate the new TV contracts. They'll both be able to take a look at it and decide if the current agreement makes sense in light of the new agreement they have. And I think the players are probably going to say, the league was pleading poverty in 2011. We took a hit for them in order that they can help get their financial situation in order. They did. Franchise values have skyrocketed. Revenue's gone up. Teams are making money now. It's time for us to recoup some of those losses, and we want to get some of that back.
It seems like we're heading towards like a really big moment in the NBA where we could see another lockout. I mean, it's going to be a couple of years, but that television deal is one piece to the pie, which I think you can even see it now. It's like DeMarcus Cousins right now at, $15 million seems high, but if the third year of his contract, the CBA jumps, the salary cap jumps because of a new television deal, then his contract could actually look relatively, tame. But it seems like the other piece to this puzzle that's really coming out, it happened in Sacramento, it happened in Milwaukee, and it's going to happen in Los Angeles with the Clippers, where teams are being sold, and you keep hearing this little murmur from the players about how much these teams are selling for. How much do you think that equity in the franchises is going to play into the next negotiations, especially when you look at that and the television contract kind of playing together into this new, I mean, BRI should like blow up. It should go crazy.
Yeah, you can make a strong argument. In fact, the league makes this argument, and in fact, I think I had made this argument on this very podcast before, that there are two separate things going on here. There's the operating the league and the money that comes from running the league, selling tickets, selling TV, selling concessions, selling jerseys, and the players get the chunk of that, which nobody is disputing. But then there is the separate investment of buying the team and the value of that team appreciating, and then you sell the team at a profit, which is just like you would do with the stock, any other kind of, appreciating asset, real estate, any other kind of investment. And you're a store renting space in a mall, and the value of that mall increases. Well, you don't get a chunk of the value increase in the mall. You just get what you're selling, because you didn't invest in the purchase or construction of the mall to begin with. Likewise, it's the owners who are investing the money in buying the team. The team's appreciating, and they're selling at a profit, but it's a profit over what they invested, and the players aren't involved in that investment. So I don't buy the argument that they deserve a lot of that. I think it's one of those things where even if a team operates at, even a small loss, as long as the team turns over before too big of amount of time passes, the owner's making his money that way. And therefore, it's one of those things that sort of helps the league to function. It provides the reason for these owners to invest in a team to begin with. It's not necessarily just because they're great sports fans or the vanity of owning a team or they want good, great courtside seats every time. It's that they want to invest their money in a place where they're going to get a good return. And, they're the ones, putting down the cash for that. As long as those two are kept separate, then that's not really an issue. Now, there was an issue during the last lockout where some of the accounting rules let them amortize some of the purchase costs in a way that showed up against revenue and therefore counted against the cap. But I think that they could negotiate their way around that problem. But the more fundamental issue of the players aren't investing in the team and therefore they don't deserve the windfall from the appreciation of that investment. If they're going to stick to their guns on that one, then I think they could be in for a fight.
All right. We are speaking to Larry Coon, salary cap expert. Larry, the Sacramento Kings do have one other situation that's bound to play out here sometime soon, and it calls for some interpretation. Jason Terry is a guy who, at 36, going on 37, his NBA days are pretty much behind him. He didn't play the second half of the season once Sacramento Kings traded for him. They let him go to Texas and rehab a knee injury that he'd had the previous year. But we could come to a situation here where, again, the Kings have a couple of options. And, can they buy him out and use a stretch provision and spread out his effect over like a 3-year period? Can they medically retire him? Or does he come back and play? I mean, those are things, does he find another team? Does he play for Sacramento next year? But what is it that you see that Jason Terry, as far as his cap figure, what can the Kings do with him outside of, just letting him play out the final year of his contract? Can they medically retire him even though his injury may not have occurred while he was with the Kings? Or is there going to be some trouble here?
It doesn't matter where his I should step back on that because there is some involvement there. But if he can't play and he's unable to play for medical reasons, then and is declared such by a league-appointed doctor, then he can come off the books after a period of time. But the waiting period of that is going to be, a year since the injury occurred. So it's not really clear how much relief the teams would get. Now, after he's out, they can't then trade their rights, and then the new team picks up the benefit of that. That's not in dispute. But it's not really clear if they would get sort of the medical relief for that in a way that would really be of value. But what you see with Terry is more of, options where Pete's sort of taking on expensive contracts and breaking them up into multiple smaller contracts that are easier to deal with. And he got Reggie Evans also, and Reggie was playing and was contributing, and was a cheap piece and could be movable. But Terry represents a player who may or may not play again. He's a guy who can come back, and if he still has some life left in him, he can contribute to the Kings and be sort of that veteran advisor to some of the young players potentially, or contribute a little bit. If he can't play, then he's on an ending contract where you're not eating that much. It's only $5.8 million for him as opposed to some of the bigger deals for some of the other guys that they had. And it's possible as an ending contract he could even be moved. He could reach the Skids on a bigger deal. He could be something where okay, we're going to trade you this asset. You got to take Jason Terry, and because he only makes 5.8 for a year, then the other team would consider doing that. So it's all about options. It's about getting a roster in place that you have different choices, and you can go in different directions depending on what's presented to you. You can go in terms of trying to put together the strong team. You can go in terms of using assets that can be moved to bring in other assets. You can go in terms of being financial assets that could be dealt around. The other good guy at doing this would have been Daryl Morey in Houston, where he's designing his whole roster in terms of what can I use to put together to make bigger deals and move in different directions in a heartbeat. And I see a lot of that same stuff in what Pete's doing.
All right, we're up against it. I know you've got somewhere to be. I got one last question. This is not the first time we've had this question for you. How shocked are you that there is still a Sacramento Kings? Because we went through this with Orange County. They survived the Seattle scare. How surprised are you?
I'm not surprised at all for a couple of reasons. One is that, I did, in fact, I think I first talked to you about this in the Salone conference at least a year ago. We were sitting in the floors discussing the possibilities, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And, saying, I'm hearing from people that the Kings are going to stay in Sacramento, that barring things falling apart with Sacramento, or barring just an unbelievable offer from someone else, and you could even say that the Seattle offer was an unbelievable offer, but clearly, not unbelievable or not, but unbelievable enough, that the Kings were pretty much going to stay in Sacramento. And that's exactly what happened. The team was able to put together the arena deal and convince the league, and the league was inclined, not that they don't want to put a team in Seattle, but they also don't want to be moving teams arbitrarily when they want to stay there and the city wants to keep them and the team is ready to put together an arena deal and get it done. They're going to try and keep the team where it is. So I'm, putting all that together, it pretty much worked out exactly like I heard it was going to.
Excellent. Well, Larry, thank you so much for coming in again. I think this is the 4th or 5th time we've had you on the podcast. It's always a pleasure.
Anytime. And tell Jonathan next time he better have a note from his doctor or something.
That's right. All right. Larry Coon, salary cap expert, thanks so much for joining the Cowbell Kingdom podcast.
You got it.
All right. Welcome back to the second part of the Cowbell Kingdom podcast. I am James Ham. Joining me for this portion, Mr. Jonathan Santiago. John, Larry was pissed that you weren't here. He was like, "Where's John? I want a doctor's note." And I'm like, "Well, John's got some stuff going on." He was harsh. I was like, "Hey, sometimes you gotta miss. It happens. It happens." So
that's okay, man. You had the great James Ham to talk to, and of course, you can carry a conversation like no other. So I think, I think he didn't miss me too much. I don't think.
Hey, I love Larry Coon. Larry Coon's been on the program, I think, 5 times. And I know that even before we had the podcast, I interviewed Larry Coon one time. I remember because I have my boys and they're noisy, I had to actually hide in my truck to do an interview with him. And it ended up being like 45 minutes long, and then I transcribed it, and it was just so dense and heavy. But it was good stuff. I definitely enjoy Larry Coon's take. I think he's got a lot of good information. He's always a real pro, and there are so few people who understand the salary cap like he does that are willing to talk to people on the outside, General managers don't like breaking down these things, and so we're left to go to Larry Coon's website, look at his FAQ, and really dig into these things when we've got situations like the Jason Terry, dilemma that's coming up for the Sacramento Kings. So it's just good insight. I always like having knowledge at my hands, and having Larry Coon at our disposal is always a very nice thing.
Yeah, and these days it seems like there's still, there are still some people who kind of just poo-poo on the whole idea of talking about the salary cap and talking about the collective bargaining agreement unless it's, lockout time like where we were at a couple of years ago. But it's an important part of covering this league. You have to understand all of these issues. You have to understand how much money a team has to spend in order to really make a true, honest assessment and also offer your own feedback and analysis on what it is that they can do. Because, it's not like the Kings can just go out there and say, sign Carmelo, sign LeBron, and sign Chris Bosh right off the bat. They don't have the money to do all of that, and it's important that you have an understanding of that, and that's why Larry's expertise is always so. I think it's always so greatly appreciated when we have him on. Yeah,
I think I love this quote by Tom Ziller, former head man of Sacktown royalty. The world is not your trade machine. To me, it's profound if you're in the basketball world, because the trade machine kind of makes it easy for people to go in and just try to throw things against the wall and see if they stick. And it's so much more complex.
Yeah.
That's one thing I think that people really should look at, is that how difficult it is to be a general manager. There's so many issues. I mean, just like, look, we break down the Jason Terry, the options, right? Jason Terry can play for the Kings this year. He's under contract for $5.85 million. Or they can try to get him to medically retire, which is going to be extremely difficult, unless he's totally done and just like, yeah, I'm medically retiring. And the NBA doctors look at his knee and say, okay, yeah, he medically, can't go anymore at age almost 37. He's done, without doing any further damage. Or the Kings could just have to buy him out, or they could hold on to him and wait till the trade deadline and have a $5.8 million, expiring contract. But, when you do go to buy someone out and you go through the waiver process, it's so dense. And, to see that the Kings can save, money by extending him out over 3 years, paying Jason Terry basically three chunks of $2 million over 3 years, as opposed to $5.8 million in 1 year. And then also they can spread out the cap hit. And, we keep talking about all the ways that this is going to be tight if they want to keep Rudy Gay at $19 million, if they want to keep Isaiah Thomas, if they want to add their first round pick and then maybe another player, they're going to have to do something. Well, literally, it's not my money, of course, to pay Jason Terry, but you've got, a nice $4 million chunk of change sitting under a rock that you can go to just by waiving Jason Terry and moving forward. And that's something I think that the Kings will, look at. And the Kings have a lot of options, not just with Jason Terry, but overall. And, I talked with Larry Coon about this. It really feels like Pete D'Alessandro is a collector of assets.
Yeah.
And I was even surprised to hear Larry Coon drop Daryl Morey's name out there, because Daryl Morey is known as a collector of assets. I mean, Daryl Morey was able to get Dwight Howard and to get James Harden and to get Jeremy Lin and Amir Ashik. But the way he was able to do it took like 2 or 3 years of him literally cashing in assets everywhere that he could. And it was really impressive to watch. Now, is it working? I don't know. And of course, D'Alessandro has a totally different base to work with than what the Rockets had to work with when when Morey took over. But still, it's an interesting way to look at the Sacramento Kings as purely a collection of assets, guys like Derek Williams, guys like Jason Terry, Reggie Evans, even like this season, Travis Outlaw, you got young talent in Ben McLemore, the Kings may buy another first round pick or a second round pick. I mean, there are just so many different options with this team that weren't there a year ago, 2 years ago. It's some pretty interesting stuff, Sean.
Yeah, we kind of touched on this in past podcasts too, but you kind of look at the deal with in terms of how they got Rudy Gay. You could basically say they traded Tyreek Evans and Thomas Robinson to get Rudy Gay because they got Gravis Vasquez for Tyreek Evans, and then Gravis is part of that deal with Toronto. They got Patrick Patterson in exchange for Thomas Robinson a year before, and of course they had all those other guys and Chuck Hayes and John Salmons in there before. And I think I talked about this in the past too. I might have brought this up, but there's a website, there was this blog called One Red Paperclip. And bear with me here while I make the association here, but it was about this guy started with One Red Paperclip, and he made a series of trades over I think a year, and went from having a paperclip and turned that paperclip into a house, and that's kind of what you do with an NBA team if you're a general manager. You wrote the great piece a couple. Maybe a week and a half ago on Jerry Reynolds on how they had the pick, what was it, the number 3 pick in the 93 draft. They turned that into Mitch Richmond, and then they flipped Mitch Richmond into Chris Webber. So out of that one pick that they had, they got 2, future Hall of Famers out of it. And that's kind of what Pete D'Alessandro is trying to do right now with this roster, is trying to, deal from a position of power where he's continuously upgrading, as opposed to, not upgrading or downgrading, staying stagnant, or so to speak. So, I mean, that's why they have so many options. You look at this roster, you talk about the possibility of them maybe using the stretch provision on Jason Terry. Hey, they could use his contract as a filler in a bigger deal. I mean, you could throw him in with Jason Thompson and Travis Outlaw, and now you're looking at a combined $13 million in salaries. You could throw in the number 7 pick or the rights to the number 7 pick to get a guy like, I don't know, Rajon Rondo or somebody like that, depending on who's available at the time. Because as we've said in the past, I mean, you look back to last year's draft, look at what New Orleans did with the number 6 overall pick. At the time, I think even weeks before the draft, if you told me or you told us in general, hey, the number 6 overall pick will get you, first time All-Star Drew Holiday, you wouldn't believe it. But that's what had happened, because the way the draft had panned out with Anthony Bennett going number 1, you got a guy like Nerlens Noel who had top 3 talent for that draft falling all the way down to the number 6 pick. Now you've got something, and potentially let's see where the Kings wind up in the draft, if they move up or if they stay where they're at or move down a little bit. But if they still have the pick going into being on the clock, maybe there's a guy on the board that a team really, really likes, and maybe they have a veteran that they're willing to deal, a solid guy who can help the Sacramento Kings out. There's just so many variables right now to consider in terms of what the Kings could do, just even heading into the draft before we even get to free agency.
Yeah, John, and I'll make the bold prediction, and I've said this to you a couple of times, and I'm going to stick with it. If the Kings are drafting number 7, I don't think there's any way they're making that pick. I just don't. I think that it's being traded. They'll move up, they'll move back, they'll move out. They, at that pick, at number 7, it's not a bad pick because, Aaron Gordon could be available there. You could also see, Marcus Smart fall to 7. I mean, there are players that are going to be there, right? But I don't think any of them help you immediately. And the Kings are in a position where
they need help now.
Their owners are saying it's time. It's time to do it now. And, the Kings, it's going to be a struggle because, the Kings do get Carl Landry back next year, which is like getting a free agent again that you didn't have last year. If they're able to keep Rudy Gay, if they're able to keep Isaiah Thomas, I mean, there are a lot of options and variables and, things are moving around, swirling around so quickly. I just don't think that the number 7 pick in this draft, while it could be a great pick and it could be a really, really good player, it's going to be a really good player 2 years from now. And that's not where the Kings are. They need to start showing quicker improvement because they have players that are young. They've got plenty of young players, but they also have players that are there to bridge the gap, to get them to the next level, like Rudy Gay. And I just think that it's time for the Kings to start making major improvements, and I think that happens through trades as a lot more often than it does through the draft to get to that next step, at least immediately. So that's where I'm at. I think that's probably the thinking of the franchise, but maybe I'm way off with that. That's my feeling. I think that they're going to move that pick. Now, if they're 1, 2, or 3, who knows what's going to happen?
But even then, if you're 1, 2, or 3, I think you just throw it out there. You at least get feelers for it. Like, what if you have the number 1 pick? Okay, maybe you just draft Joel Embiid or Andrew Wiggins or whoever you think is the number 1 guy right away. But even then, like, I think you just do your due diligence, because what if you have a team, like you have the number 1 pick and say, all right, let's throw it out there. And then Oklahoma City says, we'll give you Russell Westbrook for that pick. You know, like, that's a proven all-star, multiple-time all-star that they're willing to deal you for, a guy who may become an all-star. It depends, but he's still a ways away. I look back to, while you were talking about that, I see the Kings could really do what the Boston Celtics did back in 2007. When they struck out, obviously everyone was saying, oh, they're tanking. They want to get the number 1 pick so that they can draft Greg Oden, or even Kevin Durant at the time. They didn't end up in the top 3. And they ended up with the number 5 pick, which they then flipped to Seattle, now Oklahoma City, for Ray Allen, a guy who would help them now. And then they obviously also got Kevin Garnett from the Minnesota Timberwolves, and they formed the Big 3, and then they won the championship that year. Now, am I saying that the Kings are like 2 moves? I'm not saying the Kings are like 2 moves away from adding 2 Hall of Famers, and then all of a sudden they're going to win a championship next year. No, but I think, you just gotta gauge the value of what it is that you can get out of this draft, because there are going to be some teams out there. You and I have had conversations about this off the podcast where, hey, if Oklahoma City doesn't make it past the second round, or they don't get to the NBA Finals, do they look at their roster in addition to looking at their coaching and say, all right, we've tried enough with this team. We definitely want to keep Kevin Durant the MVP, but we got to start to retool and look a little bit further ahead to the future. Should we trade Russell? Should we trade Serge Ibaka if we have a chance to get potentially another once-in-a-generation type talent in an Andrew Wiggins or a Joel Embiid or a Jabari Parker or somebody like that? Or like a Memphis. I mean, we see this. We see this Memphis Grizzlies team. They got eliminated in the first round. They have a new head coach. John Hollinger is out there, and they're putting their stamp on this Grizzlies team. But for the most part, it's still the imprint of the old Chris Wallace regime. You have Marc Gasol, you have Zach Randolph, who's going into free agency, you have Mike Conley, you have those contracts on the books. Tony Allen, that's an ownership group and a front office that probably wants to start putting their own stamp on this franchise. And, do they go out and say, all right, let's look at what we can get from Marc Gasol, and can we trade Marc Gasol for a lottery pick for a guy who, is going to take us to the next level or has the potential to take us to the next level. I think there are options out there for the Kings that, maybe they do deal. They do deal the pick. As I mentioned, Rajon Rondo. I mean, how much does Danny Ainge like this draft? Potentially, they could trade Rondo for a pick. There's so much up in the air right now, and I think the Kings, they're just in a good spot. In terms of what it is that they can do in terms of flexibility. They have so many different options, and Pete D'Alessandro talked about it with us in that media luncheon. Is that you just have to prepare to be flexible. You have to you obviously want to have your draft board up, but at the same time you just have to prepare for the unexpected and be ready for something to come your way that you didn't necessarily see coming your way. And just like last year, I don't think they thought Ben McLemore was going to be available to them at number 7.
Not at all.
Remember, we were hearing things about them trying to move up to draft Ben McLemore, and they wind up getting the guy they wanted without having to trade any other additional assets to get him. So there's so many variables that could happen.
Yeah, John, I see this as such an important summer, but it's something that has to happen. Like, definitive moves have to be made here. Moves that are going to have a ripple effect. I was talking to somebody earlier today, and I said, the Kings have $17 million in expiring contracts walking into this season. And they're like, well, they're not going to use that. And I just looked at them. I'm like, well, they used it last year. I mean, they had, Patrick Patterson, Gravis Vasquez, and John Salmons all basically on the last year of their contracts, and then Chuck Hayes, and they threw those guys together and they got Rudy Gay. They brought in a guy who makes $19 million a year. What's to say that the Kings aren't looking at the same deal? Yep. They're not looking at the same type of thing that could transform this team. Sure, there are some dangers. You don't want to clear up all this cap space by trading for like Carlos Boozer or something like that. But that there is going to be, especially, this was a very disappointing playoffs for a lot of teams. The Western Conference was like, this is the greatest playoff of all time, right? Like, just spectacular.
Except for the second round, when guys are when teams like the Portland Trailblazers are now getting blown out.
But the first round was so incredible, and when you're looking at that first round and you're looking at teams, that the disappointment really sets in. It's not just like, oh man, we got bumped out of the playoffs. It's, do we have enough to get over? Do we have enough, or do we need to retool this? Is there a major retooling? I mean, this is a good way to segue into the Golden State Warriors. They certainly have a very, very talented team. Would they look to move some of these pieces? Would they look to make some major changes just to add depth, to add something different? I mean, clearly they're a jump shooting team. You get in the playoffs and jump shooting teams, you usually struggle. They lose and the wheels come off the bus. We have the Mark Jackson situation. Now, John, I know you're a guy who's watched the Warriors for many years. You're a guy who's covered the Warriors both down in Golden State and up here in Sacramento. I've done the same thing. I've spent plenty of time. What are your thoughts on Mark Jackson and sort of what happened to him over the last, 48, 72 hours?
I think, it's very similar to what happened to Vinny Del Negro and the Los Angeles Clippers. Vinny Del Negro guides the Los Angeles Clippers last season to the most wins in franchise history. But the guy had a peak. The guy had reached his peak basically as a head coach. And they weren't realistically, they weren't going to get any further than that. And I think that's kind of what you had in Golden State with Mark Jackson. And another problem with Mark Jackson in terms of everything that's been said and reported about the guy is just the dude didn't have any respect for anyone else outside of his players. You go back to, we look at Michael Malone here. former assistant coach with the Golden State Warriors, now head coach here with the Sacramento Kings. He talks about, he's always had nothing but kind words to say about Mark Jackson and his time with the Golden State Warriors. But at the same time, too, you can kind of hear him in some of the things he said about past coaching staffs that he's worked for. When we've asked him about Mike Brown, he says, look, hey, the reason I love working for Mike Brown is because that guy has no ego. He's a guy who, if I had a play, if I had something to offer to the table, he would let me do it in the middle of a game, and he wouldn't feel like just because he's the head coach that he has to be the man to make the call. No, he would want to do whatever it takes, even if it meant letting an assistant like me kind of take charge in a particular moment in the game. And he said, well, because before, because there are a lot of guys in this league that have egos. There are coaches in this league that have egos. And again, I'm not saying Michael Malone has said that about Mark Jackson, but based on everything that we've heard and everything that's been written, because Malone's name has popped up in some of these reports, whether it's from Yahoo or ESPN or USA Today, about there being a rift between those two, it shows that guy, Mark Jackson, was insecure about Michael Malone and his knowledge of the game, his knowledge of the X's and O's of the game, and in terms of him getting credit for what he contributed to that team and it hurting like his credibility as the coach of the Golden State Warriors. So, again, I think Mark Jackson, he did a good job. He obviously changed the culture there. They were not a winning team. They were not a winning franchise, and now they are a respectable franchise. They are a destination. But at the same time, he was a part of that change. Realistically, like as even here in Sacramento, as Pete D'Alessandro and Michael Malone have said, it all starts at the top. And Vivek Ranadive is the guy who realistically is bringing the culture change to Sacramento. The same thing in Golden State. The change in culture there began when they got rid of Chris Cohan, who had, 2 playoff appearances in 16 or 17 years. And you bring in Joe Lacob, who brings in this, championship mentality, playoff mentality from the Boston Celtics to the Golden State Warriors. He was a minority owner in the Celtics. So, it's good job for Mark Jackson for what he was able to accomplish. But in the end, when you don't treat people with respect, everybody with respect, including your superiors and including, just not just only the players, but if you don't treat your front office staff and everybody else with respect, it's going to come back to bite you in the butt. And that's what it looks like. That's what looks like what happened in Golden State with Mark Jackson.
Yeah, I think, John, people are missing a couple of things. Like, I've read so much on this, and it's kind of like the Donald Sterling situation from the week before. This is it's the off season for so many people that there's so many people waiting to write about something or talk about something. And I felt like some of the things that are missing from the Mark Jackson conversation that you and I it's not like we don't know who Mark Jackson is. I mean, I've been in a scrum with Mark Jackson, this whole time. I was in the scrum when, he literally found out moments before that Monte Ellis had been traded. That was in Sacramento. I mean, we were standing there and it was like, Monte Ellis just got traded. And you watch Mark Jackson, he's pacing the floor. He's finally got to come over and talk to the media. Look, it's a difficult job, being a head coach in the NBA. But in my 4 years, I've had the privilege of standing in scrums with some of the greatest coaches that have ever coached the game of basketball. Jerry Sloan, Phil Jackson, George Karl, Greg Popovich, Rick Adelman. The list goes on and on of the coaches that we get to see. And each of them have their nuances, their quirks. You always wait for Greg Popovich to light somebody up who asks a stupid question. Kevin McHale, I've told people this a couple of times, that Kevin McHale has a strange way about him. When he's done in a scrum, when he's done talking, whether it's he's bored or whether someone asks something he doesn't want to talk about it anymore, he literally mid-sentence just goes, you know what, I'm done. And he says, see you later, and just walks right away. He walks away from the scrum, and you're like, what just happened? The thing I'll say about Mark Jackson is he's not in my top 10 like people to stand in a scrum and interview, because I don't think he ever treats people that well in a scrum. I think he's condescending, and I think he's rude, and I think that that's something that hurts his credibility with the media. But when I see that some of this stuff is kind of come out, that may be the way that he treats like people above him, it makes perfect sense to me. I said this about Klay Thompson the first time we ever had Klay Thompson through, and I don't think Klay Thompson's a bad kid. I'll just say this, like Klay Thompson, when you interview him, to me, he's exactly what you expect from a kid who his dad played in the NBA for like 10 years or 15 years. He's got that my dad was an NBA player vibe to him, that, he's cocky. He doesn't have time for what you're asking. There's just, and even like the first time we met him in pre-draft, I felt that way about him. That's kind of what Mark Jackson is. He's kind of like, yeah, dude, I played for, teams that went to the Eastern Conference Championship. I'm the third leading assist man in the history of the NBA, whatever he is. It's right around there. He just kind of like, he wears it so heavy and thick, and it doesn't always come across the right way. And I don't know Mark Jackson personally, being in the scrums with him and everything else. I don't know who he is off the court. I have seen him in the hallways, and he smiles and says hello. And I've thought to myself, that was weird, because that's not the person that I ever see like when I'm talking with other media members. But maybe he's just misunderstood, and maybe it is a cultural thing. Maybe there are other issues in play here. I know, was it Marcus Thompson, the second, the Golden State Warriors, former beat writer turned columnist now. He wrote a long piece about race and Mark Jackson, and there were a couple of things in that piece that I understood, and a couple of pieces that I thought he missed on, but that's just my own personal take on it. And I'm not like Marcus Thompson, I'm not a 33-year-old African American. So, of course my view is going to be skewed, but, I think that there is something about, a cultural thing, that, he wants to be respected as far as an NBA coach, and the way he went about earning that respect was very different than other coaches that I've had to deal with in the past. So I don't know, John. We just spent 10 minutes talking about the Golden State Warriors, which I fully did not expect to do on the
I bet you the fans already shut this off. They're like, screw this. Why are they talking about the Warriors?
Why are they talking about the Warriors?
Why are they talking about the Golden State Warriors? There's no reason to talk about that
why aren't we talking about Charles Barkley eating churros?
Shaquille O'Neal, how would you drink Shaq soda and eat churros at the same time?
Oh my gosh.
I'm just gonna say that didn't look like eating churros to me. That looked like some other type of action that we will not dive into.
Not a good look. Not a good look. So yeah, John, it's going to be the slow build up to May 20th, where we've got the draft lottery. Then we're going to start seeing prospects come through. This is sort of the calm before the storm. I mean, we've got all kinds of stuff that's about to happen, especially with the Sacramento Kings just right in the mix. I would love it if somehow they land in the top 3. And the intensity of this conversation just gets put on steroids, and we get to see again. The last couple of years, the Kings were just shunned by the top prospects.
Well, even when you look back to the 2012 draft, in hindsight now, none of the guys like Thomas Robinson, Harrison Barnes, Bradley Beal, those guys weren't coming through Sacramento because they were apparently all fighting for the number, the 2 through 4 spots, but. You know who did come through Sacramento? Damian Lillard, Andre Drummond. Those guys arguably are the 2 best players behind Anthony Davis who were selected in that draft.
John Henson.
Yeah, John Henson came through too.
While he hasn't had a breakout career so far, John Henson is a very, very talented young player who would be like a spectacular fit next to DeMarcus Cousins. I think we've talked about that in the past. But
you know what else we haven't talked about too, in terms of off the court stuff? We haven't even touched on the arena situation here. I mean, the final agreements between the city of Sacramento and the Kings postponed for now. They've delayed the vote. The vote was supposed to be May 13th, and then the following day they were expected to start on demolition on the downtown plaza. That's been pushed back indefinitely right now, but it may cause some concern. But in terms of what you've heard and what we've heard, everybody within that realm from the Kings and the city, they're kind of just saying, look, it's not that big of a deal. We're just still figuring some things out, but it's not going to completely affect the project. But at the same time, it does raise some eyebrows, obviously.
Yeah.
When this project has started and stopped so many different times and different occasions, now it's different ownership group now, but again, it's been pushed back, and there hasn't really been a timetable or update yet in terms of when those things are going to happen soon.
Eventually, there was going to be a negotiation, John.
Yeah.
Eventually, and what we haven't had up to this part, what we've had is like a handful of people like holding hands, skipping through a park, and acting like this is like everything is perfect, the world is perfect, singing like Kumbaya songs together. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a negotiation. So at some point, the immortal words of David Stern, life is a negotiation. We knew it was coming. So I'm not concerned. Again, my sources inside have told me this is nothing. Like, this is just the way, this is I's and T's. This is just things getting finished up, and it's no big deal. But you never know, John. You never know. I mean, I think the new ownership group already has put out $35 million.
$30 million
in property. I think it did it.
Or 35.
Is it
they remember the price tag of the arena went up $30 million, and that's something that they're just chipping in themselves.
Well, but that was for practice facility and
Yeah.
a couple other things. So yeah, I mean, those things are going to happen. And also, I know that the new term sheet, the city was going to make like an additional $30 million in lease payments over the course of the 30 years as well. So so there are a lot of like moving pieces here, and this has been expected at some point that we would have that moment where it's like, hey, maybe we need to just sit down and negotiate every little fine nuance of this deal before we put it out there, especially with the way that lawsuits and other things have been brought up in this situation. So, yeah, John, I don't expect any major hiccup here, but this is always, it's trial and error. They're learning this game. So, and John, the one other thing I want to bring up, the Sacramento Kings inside, they're going to make changes. We're going to see more changes this summer because this franchise had a year to assess people and sort of put their own personal touch on this organization. And one of the good guys of the Kings organization is no longer there in Fat Lever. Plenty of nice conversations with Fat over the last couple of years. He and I would have, especially, we like to make coffee at the same time on game nights, and we always had discussions on how we made our coffee. He's a good man, and a lot of good people in the transition of this franchise have gone different ways, and you always feel for them. People that we knew really well, Devin Blankenship, Darren May in the past, Troy Hansen. There's going to be more. It's the bloodletting that is sort of the changing of the guard when you replace an entire ownership, management, coaching staff, everything with an NBA team. So just want to wish Fat all the best in his new endeavors, wherever that is. I know he's been heavy into NBA cares and a lot of other things. Just a good dude, all around good dude.
Yeah, he is a good guy. He will definitely, I think, bounce back pretty easily. He was by far, a lot of people say, hey, that guy might have been the greatest rebounding point guard in the league in league
Ever.
history.
Yeah.
So he was a great player, and he's a guy who's got that credibility working on his side and also in addition to having worked in basketball operations for quite some time as well.
Yeah.
So I think on that note, let's wrap up this edition of the Cowbell Kingdom podcast, and tune in next week where we'll be back with another episode. Thanks to Larry Coon for joining us on this week's episode of the Cowbell Kingdom podcast, and don't forget to rate us on iTunes, subscribe to us on iTunes, and subscribe to us on YouTube now. We're going to, some of the old podcasts have been removed from the site, but we're going to eventually re-upload a ton of them or all of them actually, to the YouTube channel, so you can check back on previous episodes, even 2-3 years ago.
Yeah,
and
144 episodes.
We'll have those up. So for James Ham, I'm Jonathan Santiago. Thanks again for tuning in and listening to the Cowbell Kingdom podcast.